Riddle me this. Which tube line exists, but doesn't exist? Well, if you read the title of this video, you're probably going to say the Hampstead Tube. I'd imagine you know how this game is played. The Hampstead Tube is one of the early deep-level lines. Thousands of people use it every day, and it's a vital part of the London Underground. But there is no line called the Hampstead Tube. Not these days, anyway. I think it's time for some history. The Hampstead Tube was the short name of the Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead Railway. It's now part of the Northern Line. Appropriately enough, it owes its origins to another underground railway which is also part of the Northern Line. In 1890, the City and South London Railway became the first deep-level tube railway, and was an instant success. As is so often the case in the history of, well, everything, the financial success of the City and South London led to imitators. One of these was a line called the Hampstead, St Pancras and Charing Cross Railway. The scheme changed its name to the Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead Railway in 1893, the year the scheme received royal assent. This railway was going to consist of a line from Charing Cross to Hampstead with a branch off to Euston. It was to be cable-hauled rather than electric, as the early electric locomotives used on the City and South London had trouble with gradients. And the CCEHR anticipated they'd have plenty of those on the way to Hampstead. It was also going to end pointing down the Strand towards the city. It's one thing to plan a railway, it's quite another to raise the money to do it, and this was exactly the problem the CCEHR ran into. So they spent the rest of the 1890s revising their plans. They decided to have the southern end pointing at the river rather than the city, and, significantly, to scrap the branch to Euston. This was partly for operational reasons and partly because the Midland Railway, who owned St Pancras Station, objected to any possible extension under their premises. And another branch was added, this time from Camden Town to Kentish Town. Meanwhile, the form of haulage was changed to electric. But no construction was undertaken. That would have to wait for the man from Chicago. The man in question was Charles Tyson Yerkes, a transport tycoon and dodgy dealer looking to build an empire in London after the city fathers of Chicago had wised up to his shady activities. Shady though he was, he brought two things to the table that most of the tube schemes didn't have. One was money and the other was expertise. The CCEHR had potential, he felt. With the help of his assistant, a man with the unlikely name of Delancey Louderback, he bought the line out in 1900. There were going to be a few changes. Yerkes wanted to take things further. There are a couple of stories as to how this came about. One says that a lady met Yerkes on the ship to Britain, where he told her his dreams of bringing the tube to the good people of Hampstead, Highgate and beyond. Another says that he took a hackney carriage out into the fields beyond Hampstead, stopped at an apparently arbitrary spot and declared that this would be the terminus. It seems likely that both of these stories are made up. What is true is that he wanted to extend to Golders Green, which at the time was out in the countryside. This was less the culmination of a romantic vision and more building on his experience in Chicago, where he'd seen new suburbs develop around his streetcar lines. There were also to be extensions from Kentish Town to Highgate and Charing Cross to Victoria. The Victoria extension was not authorised, and the Highgate one was only authorised as far as Archway. Despite complaints from residents that the tube would destroy the character of Hampstead Heath, vibrate trees out of the ground and cause drought, yes, those were all real objections, the extension to Golders Green was authorised, complete with a depot at the end. While plans were being made for the CCEHR, Yerkes had acquired a number of other tube schemes which would come together under the umbrella of Underground Electric Railways of London, or UERL. All the electricity was to come from Lots Road Power Station in Chelsea, common equipment was to be used on all the lines, and all the new stations were to be designed by the house architect. Leslie Green. Yerkes would pass away in 1905, but his legacy was the nucleus of the modern underground. Although the CCEHR was the first line in which Yerkes had taken an interest, it was the last to open, on the 22nd of June 1907. The opening was carried out by future Prime Minister David Lloyd George. By this time, the names Hampstead Tube and Hampstead Railway had become semi-official ones. They appeared on signage for the line. The trains were of American manufacture by the American Car and Foundry Company, no British manufacturer being able to fulfil the line's order quickly enough, or, UERL felt, having the necessary experience in building steel coaches. At the time, railway coaches in Britain were normally made of wood. UERL seemed keen to render their line as fireproof as possible. That meant paved platforms, steel trains, and where wood was to be used, the relatively hard-to-ignite mahogany. Instead of modern sliding doors, the trains were fitted with manually operated gates that could be opened and closed by station staff. The ever-snobby Railway Magazine was quick to condemn the working-class staff of the CCEHR for saying Hampstead and Highgate instead of Hampstead and Highgate, like them of us what talk proper, and observed that, perhaps, when the company is appointing new conductors, candidates may be advised on the proper use of the aspirate. While the tube announcers now may have more genteel accents, it should be noticed that they say Highgate instead of the more common Highgate, and I can't help but wonder if that's a hangover from those days. The line was a varied success. Some stations were more popular than others. It won't surprise anyone to learn that the now abandoned South Kentish town wasn't well patronised. But nor were Chalk Farm, Goodge Street, Warren Street, Mornington Crescent, or even the now overcrowded Camden Town. In the early 20th century, those were largely residential or industrial areas, with those who worked there living within walking distance. The company reduced services to the lesser-used stations and even reduced their fares to encourage passengers. Despite this, Yerkes' speculation was beginning to pay off. Land values in Hampstead and Golders Green, as well as the neighbouring areas, were on the rise. From villages and hamlets, new suburbs developed, within easy reach of central London. In 1910, the Hampstead Tube became part of London Electric Railways. This was really an administrative thing more than anything else. An official grouping of UERL's underground lines. In 1914, the line was extended a single station south to Embankment, with a reversing loop under the River Thames. This created a connection with the District, Circle and Bakerloo lines and was a great success. Trains rapidly went from being underused to being overcrowded. Plans were already afoot to extend further in the other direction, from Golders Green to Edgware. It took a while to get this one off the ground, with a lot of negotiation. In the early 1920s, the government was looking to invest in schemes that could bring employment, and so London Electric Railways were quick to put their scheme forward. It was authorised, and in 1923 Hendon was reached. That being said, the route wasn't the most direct because, ironically, the urban growth stimulated by the underground got in the way of the original proposed route. The following year, 1924, the line arrived at Edgware. In 1926, another extension opened, which would bring the story of the Hampstead Tube, as an individual line, to an end. In 1913, the City and South London Railway, remember that, was bought out by UERL, and almost immediately the new owners began making plans to connect it to the Hampstead Tube. In 1924, the City and South London was extended to Camden Town, and in 1926 the Hampstead Tube extended south via Waterloo to Kennington. A number of names were tried for the new combined line, but in 1937 they'd settle on the Northern Line. Good evening. I do hope you enjoyed this speculative tale from the tube. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I'd like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon. You are the Delancey to my Louderback. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.